Some of my all-time favorite games required real commitment for me to learn to love them. Of course, this isn't the others serving selfless agape love of the New Testament I'm talking about, but the more pedestrian, selfish kind of love like that for ice cream and music. Nevertheless, it was a self-serving love that required commitment, because I definitely did not enjoy the games I'm going to talk about when I first tried them out. But when they eventually did win me over, they each opened up my gaming hobby to new experiences that I loved, and in some cases forever broadened the type of games that I like to play. This is my top 5 games I had to learn to love. Coming in at number 5 is Elex. I really wanted to love the world of this. Well, I mean, I did love the world of this game, but in previews, I saw what the world looked like, this almost sort of Thundar the Barbarian post-apocalyptic world with magic fused into it as well. So I really was just entranced by the world. But getting into the game, it had a somewhat Souls-like stamina system, not full on, but enough that, like, you can't just button mash for sure. And there's a vulnerability as well that reminded me a bit of Souls-likes, and I just don't like playing difficult action games. I'm not good at them, and I have no desire to get good at them. And so this one was rubbing me the wrong way big time at first. It also had a little bit of that AA jank and clunk that comes with, the animations and some of the combat and the controls and things. But nevertheless, I still love exploring AA games because they often have the ability to try some things that AAA games won't risk trying. After taking a time away from this game in which I thought I was done with it, for some reason, I did a little bit of research on like, what do people love about this game? How do people get enjoyment out of this game? And what I learned that I didn't understand at first was that you really are expected to have this zero to hero experience. It's not like Skyrim, where it's auto-balanced to give you basically the same level of challenge no matter where you are in the game world and no matter what level you are. This one was more like the old school of, no, you will feel yourself getting more powerful through leveling. And to the point where, like, early on, it's even really advantageous to just avoid combat whenever you can. And there's plenty of, fetch quests that are way more interesting than fetch quests typically are. The writing, the interaction with the world, the role that you can play in the world is a lot more interesting than a number of other RPGs. And so even those early missions where you're avoiding combat but still gaining XP were interesting. And before I knew it, I was able to risk now and then getting into some combat with enemies along the way. And every time I gained a level and spent some points, I felt it. I felt it the next time I got into combat. On top of that, there's no carrying capacity in this game, and every bit of loot, everything you can pick up and take with you is valuable or potentially valuable in some way. Even if you can sell it for almost nothing, it's worth picking up. And you just feel that with the pushback of this world, even on the easier difficulty settings, which of course I had it on. And so suddenly looting, picking up stuff, it never got old because I always felt the value in doing that. And with an unlimited carrying capacity, I could do that to my heart's content. And so it made interaction with the world, looting in the world, exploring the world, all that more meaningful, all that much more engaging. Of course, I mentioned already the writing and your interactions with the world. There's multiple factions that you can kind of flirt with joining. Ultimately, you do kind of have to commit to one, but for a while, you can do a lot of their quests. And the writing, the characters, it's just a really interesting world to make your place in. And despite the pretty wooden facial animations, the voice acting I find in Elex is very solid. And again, the world, really, I was so glad when I came back to it and discovered that I could enjoy this game, because the world really did pay off in such an interesting way to figure out the past of this world, how it got to the point that it's at now, what the future might hold. Just a great world to explore and get to know more and more. And I would say that, just broadly speaking, it with some key exceptions, scratches a very similar itch to Bethesda RPGs. You're not a blank slate character in Elex, but there's enough systems, role-play systems, skills, abilities that you can gain, crafting, all the loot, all those kinds of elements of interacting and branching quests, different ways, numerous ways to resolve most quests. So there's this sense of it being a living world that you're exploring and finding your place in, and that the skills support the simulation of that feeling. And so Bethesda RPGs, they push back, or they don't push back in the way that Elex does. So I wouldn't want to say, hey, if you like Bethesda games, you're going to like this. But there's some significant overlap that I think make Elex worth checking out, worth doing research on, worth maybe even giving a try. It's very often on sale on both Xbox and PlayStation platforms. Worth giving a try at a low price just to see if maybe you could learn to love Elex. At number 4 is The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, played back in the day on the original Xbox 360. In fact, I'm still coming back and playing the game save that I started, I named it after my son that was going to be born in a few months. We'd chosen the name Titus, and so that's my character's name. And Titus is now 13 years old. So this is an old save that I'm still coming back to. When I first played this game, it felt at the time too open. And I was like, what do I do? I was still coming out of the era of RPGs that you could really fully explore and fully experience. You know, JRPGs is primarily what I'm thinking of. And even getting into action RPGs, as I slowly did with games inspired by the Diablo series, coming to this, a first-person action RPG, there was things about it that the combat, for one, was like, oh, it feels kind of slow and sluggish, and I was just trying to figure out what's the fun in the combat itself. The spell animations were cool at first. They really don't age near as well as the spell animations in, say, Skyrim, which came after this one. But there was things about the presentation and the moment-to-moment experience of like combat and just moving around in the world that I was like, they took a lot of getting used to. I was not used to the first-person perspective. And added to that, the fact that it felt so open, I was like, I don't even know what to do. And I eventually started focusing on the main quest, but I was like, I feel like I'm missing so much of this world, and I didn't like that feeling. But then at some point, I think it was after I had actually finished a playthrough of the main campaign, it was years later when after I had played other games, after I had played even Skyrim, if I remember correctly, I learned over time, this is what these games are, and this is what you can experience. So that the answer to my question that I didn't realize is, the question, what do I do? What do I do? Anything. Or at least that's what it feels like to first play a game like this, is that the game just allows you to do anything. Now, with any game, you spend enough time with it, you see the limitations, and that feeling of limitless potential does start to shrink for sure. But there was nothing like it before, except for Morrowind, which I hadn't played. And so that feeling, that illusion that I could do anything in this world, there was nothing like it. And so coming back to it, I had learned, not through actually playing The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion for a certain amount of time, but through playing other games. They taught me how to love The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. And I came back to it and I just dived into its factions and reputation system, all the spells and potions that you can craft, both spells and potions you can invent yourself, and how meaningful the alchemy system, the potions made exploring and picking up all that you could in terms of ingredients in the open world or fallen from enemies. And the skill system, even more than Elex, which of course I had not played at this time. Elex is a much more recent game, but the skills in a Bethesda game like Oblivion, there are so many of them that are relevant to different ways you can interact with the world. and many of them outside of combat, which it's those out of combat skills that really make an RPG world come alive to me, my simulated interaction with it. And the idea that all these NPCs, they kind of have routines, they go about their day. There's this feeling in a game like this where the world keeps on living and going about its business whether you interact with it or not. And again, it creates that illusion of this is a living world that I can really immerse myself into. And it's a game that you don't finish. It was one of the first games where I realized, you don't finish this game. It's not a game where you check every box. I'd gotten used to that and had kind of a completionist attitude about a number of things. I still do. Like, I'm currently hoping to check off exploring every single dungeon and closing every Oblivion gate in this game. It's taken me a while. But I mean, I give up really on the idea of making that a primary goal, to finish everything, to do everything, because there's a sense in which for most people you just can't. And that's what keeps that illusion of limitless potential intact for me. It's also special to me because it's my oldest son Asher's favorite game. I asked him yesterday if it was still his favorite game of all time, and he said yes. And I remember playing this when he was still very young, just barely more than a toddler, and we would play fight with fantasy weapons in the living room, and when he would kill me, I would lie down and play dead and notice that his fingers were tapping around on my chest while I had my eyes closed, and I thought, what is he doing? And he was making a sound like... And it dawned on me, he'd been watching me play Oblivion. He was looting my body. And so even from that early age, he was absorbed in this game, as so many of us are, and eventually learned to play it and love it himself. I am wondering if we are going to get an official announcement of the rumored remake for The Elder Scrolls Oblivion. I think it's even more than a rumor. I think there's arguably enough evidence that we could maybe call it a leak at this point, but the timing is still uncertain. But with Xbox's event coming in a few weeks, it would be really cool for me and my son, I know, if they announced a remake of my number 4 game that I had to learn to love, The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. My number 3 game is Neverwinter Nights on PC, not to be confused with the Neverwinter MMO. This was released in, I want to say, the early to mid 2000s on PC, and I got it much later than other people on PC because I've never bothered with trying to keep a PC with real gaming specs, and so I tend to just play older games. And so I got to this one later than most. And it was around the same time. I kind of have to give honorable mention to a few other games: Final Fantasy XII, Dragon Age Origins, and Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. All of these games, including Neverwinter Nights, use what is often called the real-time with pause combat system, where it's not exactly an action RPG like Diablo, where you press a button and you swing your weapon as a result, but rather you press a button to select a target, and then your character or characters will continue auto-attacking that target until you give them a different command, which you can do live without pausing combat, or in real-time with pause games. If things are getting really intense and you need a little bit more time to think, then you can pause the action at any time and give out commands to your single or multiple party members that you are controlling. When I first played, and this, I should say, Real Time with Pause is one of my absolute favorite types of fantasy RPGs, that game system type, that combat type. But what I found when I first played Neverwinter Nights was that it felt too complicated. I don't remember if I first tried this one before trying Final Fantasy XII. It was definitely before Dragon Age Origins. I think I can't remember if it was around. I think I went to KOTOR after Neverwinter Nights because I found out it was made by the same people. But anyway, I'm not a PC gamer, particularly because of keyboard and mouse. Well, and because of the technical troubleshooting that usually comes with it. I just don't like keyboard and mouse. And so it also felt too complicated with the rule system itself. It was the D&D, I want to say 3rd edition rules. And so I was just like, at first, all I could do to get into the game was play a fighter, the simplest class you could possibly play. Because trying to play a magic user, I was like, this is way too complicated, not fun. I think that was the first time maybe I gave up. And then I went back to it sometime later as a fighter. And that's when it started to kind of work for me, to get its hooks into me. I, over time, gave my fighter skill abilities in the rogue class so that he could, for example, use magic device. And that allowed me to dip my toe into the world of magic in this rules system, because I could find spell scrolls or wands or, certainly all kinds of different potions that I could craft and use. And that was really how my journey had to go, starting with just a simple dumb fighter and then adding some skills to explore the different facets of the D&D rules. I did eventually buy, like really cheap at a used bookstore, a player's handbook for D&D 3rd edition so that I could look up rules that weren't fully explained in the game itself. And while I don't think that was essential to me, it was helpful now and then to just flesh things out in my mind, understand the systems a little bit more, and wrap my head around them more effectively. But, once I started doing that, then I started seeing some of that same feeling I had with Elder Scrolls Oblivion, which I think I played after playing this game. I can't remember. Anyway, but that feeling of this immersive world that you can interact with in so many ways that don't have to do with combat, in addition to, of course, combat being enjoyable and having all these different skills, and especially when you become a magic user, all these different cool spells you can learn. So it really had that sense of potential to interact with this world and make my way in this world, be whatever kind of character I wanted to be in this world, and behave and interact with others in the way that I would want to experiment with and see how the world reacts to. And this was also one of the first games, I'm trying to remember, I don't know. I think maybe on PS2 there was some of this going on as well, but the sound effects in this game were just super satisfying. Every time you opened up a chest or looted a body, you hear those sound effects of rustling through leather armor or, rustling through a chest or a drawer or something like that. Just the attention given to the sound design in this game, man, that goes a long way for me as someone that's very auditorily wired. And I still feel just this cozy, warm feeling when I get back into this game and open up a drawer or loot a dead body. And on that front, the loot, very satisfying, so much to find, so much to choose between, and that sense of how your loot makes you more powerful, more capable, in addition, of course, to the way the XP and leveling system makes you feel like you're progressing and becoming more powerful. And then on top of all that, being a PC game, I had access to console commands. This was one of the first PC games I played, and I discovered how much more accessible cheating is, if you want to, on PC than it is on consoles. And so finding this world of console commands was like, you know what, if this is pushing back a little bit more than I want to in difficulty, and I don't want to deal with, because at first it was about not wanting to deal with learning the systems. I was like, I'm sure there's some systems I could leverage here. I just don't want to slow down combat that much. Then I don't have to. I just open up the console commands and gain a level. Gain 2 levels, maybe even 3, and then jump back in and have, a more easy breezy experience. And of course, as I've gone back through and played the game campaign again, I did that less because I'm becoming more familiar with the systems. But just having that option available to me was just fantastic as I was learning to appreciate what this game had to offer. And of course, one of the things that I love about Neverwinter Nights, that I love about so many... Well, I don't want to say so many RPGs, because it's actually much more rare than you would think and than I would like. But that classic D&D aesthetic, that pseudo-serious sword and sorcery D&D aesthetic that isn't all bright and cutesy and anime and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't have the whimsy of Saturday morning that some other fantasy games have. It's really, but neither is it like super dark and gothic. It's just taken itself pretty seriously with some humor here and there. And I just love that kind of fantasy world. I love the art that for decades has inspired the world of D&D, and certainly that carried over into Neverwinter Nights. Oh my gosh. And I have to comment on the seemingly endless adventure modules that players made using the tool set in this game that was readily available to anyone who bought the game. That's one of the things this game is famous for, and unfortunately you can't get access to on the console versions. But on the PC version, you still, to this day, have access to so many adventure modules that people basically just converted from paper and pencil adventure modules for D&D. And I can only imagine that made it really much easier to create new adventures for players to make that basically they didn't have to play test for balancing the difficulty like you would normally, or come up with a whole story from scratch. There was probably a good amount of copying and pasting of stats and dialogue and stuff that they were just able to do. And I think that is probably chiefly what allowed for so many adventure modules to be created. This game, to my knowledge, does not keep track of player hours. I really wish that it did, because I just can't help but wonder if maybe next to Monster Hunter World would be the game that I've put the most hours into. I don't know. But wow, so many hours enjoyed in this game. These days, as far as games like this, games inspired by it, like, say, Pillars of Eternity or Pathfinder, Kingmaker, Pathfinder, Wrath of the Righteous, there are certainly others of this type that I would rather sit down and play now, but none gave me the amazing experience of first learning to love Neverwinter Nights on the PC. Coming in at number 2 is Bioshock, a game that opened up the entire genre of first-person shooter to me. I first tried this game, I tried the demo, and because I'd just been hearing accolade upon accolade, and that doesn't necessarily mean much to me, because usually reviewers and people that are giving out awards, they just are not, they're better at playing games, action games, than I am, and which is the main factor. But also, I'm just particular. I like what I like, and I don't like what I don't like. But in addition to all the accolades, a friend recommended this to me, and I was like, okay, I'll at least try the demo. Well, I tried it, and I was like, this is too hard for me. It was scary, and at the time, I didn't even get far enough into the demo to die. I just felt like this is scary, and so I assumed it was hard. I assumed basically it was some kind of survival horror type game, which are built in some ways on the idea of enemies being too difficult for you to fight, so you just need to run and get away from them and survive somehow. And so I was just like, no, not my type of game. But over time, I kept hearing the accolades. It wasn't just like a game of the year. People were talking about this game like this was revolutionary and game of the decade type talk. And so I, over time, did a little bit more research, watched a few more reviews that got into some of the more details that I care about compared to like a pretty surface level IGN type review. I learned about its difficulty settings and its respawn system, which combined, I was like, the respawn system is really generous. You really don't lose anything. At least, I don't know if that's just on the easiest difficulty or not, but basically there are these respawn tanks littered all over the game that every time you pass by one, it's kind of like a little autosave triggers, and if you die, you basically get warped back there with full health, and you lose nothing. And then any enemy that you've been fighting, they still have lost the health that you have whittled them down to. So it's like it's not even restarting or being sent back in time. You are literally being like teleported in a sense and given your health back, and then you just get back into it if you want. And so that combined, and I don't think that's happened to me once. In all the hours I've put into all 3 of the Bioshock games, I don't know that I've actually died once. And maybe once to test that, but beyond that, the difficulty settings can make the game easy enough even for someone like me that not only doesn't have the hand-eye coordination and reflexes that a number of action game players do, but I also really get immersed in games. And so if they're scary, sometimes even if they're not intended to be scary, there's just like, I feel the intensity of it. I probably feel, without even getting close to death, the kind of intensity that thrill seekers play really difficult games for. I get that on easy games, just if you've done your work well as a developer in creating a great atmosphere or good music or design of monsters in the world or whatever. So I really feel the pushback just in the vibe of this game alone. And even going back to it again, I don't think I've taken it off of the lowest difficulty because I just still feel that intensity of the environment itself, which, wow, is just such an original setting and world and story. And it was maybe the first game I played that had not only a really interesting world, but a world that was not in its default state. It was in a state of ruin because something horrible had happened. And so there's two layers to the exploration of Bioshock. There's the layer of, wow, what is this interesting world I'm in? And then the layer of, what the crap happened to this interesting world that I'm in? And then it's not just the plot beat of, okay, what was the trigger that made it all go to crap? It's what happened to the people here, what changed them, what did they experience, and the journal entries you're finding everywhere that you can listen to flesh that out slowly over time. And by the way, there's still games that leave journal entries around, clearly inspired by this type of game. Probably System Shock before it. I think this game definitely was inspired by System Shock. But anyway, there's so many games that leave journal entries around and don't allow you to listen to them on the go. You have to stop and listen to them in your menu, or stop and listen to them because they're just embedded in the environment. And this one allowed you to pick up those journal entries and listen on the go, even in the middle of combat. And so there's always that feeling of moving forward, even as you're exploring, you're learning the story, and it's giving me the story in a new way I'd never experienced in games. It's environmental storytelling, or storytelling while I am still engaged. I guess I'd experienced this with Bethesda RPGs, but it was still quite the novelty to not be forced to sit through a cutscene where I'm not involved at all. No, I'm still involved. I'm still in this world, experiencing it as the story is being told. And it's a philosophical game exploring some really interesting ideas that are typically not explored, particularly because they arguably are not left-leaning. They're arguably right-leaning in some ways, certainly not theist. Well, actually, they're exploring some ideas from objectivism and Ayn Rand, and it's really a criticism of objectivism and just kind of how things would play out if we had a society that was ruled by objectivism. And so if anything, it's saying, no, that's not the way to go, and actually has Christians portrayed in a light of them being persecuted, that's really unusual to put Christians in a sympathetic light in any way in fiction or video games. Just lots of interesting stuff to think about as you're playing this game. So it's engaging the mind and the emotions on multiple levels. And of course, without spoiling the nature of it, there's a great twist at the end that makes you rethink your entire experience of playing the game, you know. But really the greatest thing by far that Bioshock did for me was it made me aware of the fact that shooters were being made different than action games of the past, starting around this time. They were more and more in action games, developers were incorporating difficulty settings. I used to cheat with the Game Genie to play action games and to enjoy action games on the NES, SNES, and the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2. But getting into the Xbox 360 era, you really didn't have cheat devices to take advantage of. And so I was like, well, there goes my enjoyment of action games that I had for a number of years there. But I didn't realize that in the place of cheat devices, not all, but a number of game developers were really leaning into difficulty settings to make it accessible for players that are not good at action games and don't have any interest in beating their heads against the wall to get good. And that's me. So I explored, after playing Bioshock, more first-person shooters, which led me to the Far Cry franchise, which actually I enjoy much more than the Bioshock games. As much as I enjoy the Bioshock games, I haven't really gone through and played any of those through a second time all the way through, and I've done that with at least one or two of the Far Cry games. But it was Bioshock that I have to thank for opening me up to the world of first-person shooters, and it took a while. I was turned off, and I had to come back to it in phases. But eventually, I'm so glad that I learned to love Bioshock. Finally, this will come as no surprise, my number one is Monster Hunter World. Well, no surprise for those familiar with my content. I'm so sorry for those who are sick of hearing me talk about Monster Hunter World or Rise. But this game, oh, man, it's like Bioshock in that it opened up a whole new genre to me. But while Bioshock really opened up a whole genre, I guess Monster Hunter World opened me up to both a genre, but so far it's still just the one franchise. I keep thinking maybe I'll get into some other monster hunting games like God Eater and stuff, but there's just so much Monster Hunter still for me to enjoy. I haven't quite had the reason to get around to really diving into those other ones yet. And man, let me tell you, I was interested in this game from the previews, like the E3 type previews and stuff. It looked really interesting and immersive. I think what was pulling me in a bit was the idea of hunting a monster, learning about the nature of a monster, because I love monster horror movies like Aliens and Predator, Jeepers Creepers, that follow this formula of there's a weird monster, it's really dangerous, but the nature of it is a real mystery until over time you learn about it. You have brief encounters with it, and you're putting together over the course of the movie the nature of this monster, what it can do, what its limitations are, what its weaknesses are, and how you can defeat it. And so that whole, whatever itch that is scratching, I think it's related to exploration, but whatever itch that is scratching in horror movies for me, I'm getting that scratched in Monster Hunter World. And what I think made it difficult for me to really appreciate and fall in love with right away was that it pushed back in terms of its difficulty. It does not have difficulty settings. You have to figure out, is there a way that you can make this easier on yourself? It's not exactly Souls-like. In fact, it's definitely not Souls-like. But it still does have a stamina system that is relevant. Not near as relevant in combat. I think you can pretty much just, at least the weapon I'm using, I only play with sword and shield. That was said to be the easiest one to start with. Well, I've started with it and stuck with it and still haven't branched out, although I do aspire to in the back of my mind. But anyway, there are what I learned, just tons of systems that were introduced to me through tutorial page vomit. One after another. I'm really grateful for them. I'm grateful even more that they were stored in my player menus so I could go back and revisit those. But there were so many that I couldn't keep them all in my head. And there are tons of systems in Monster Hunter World that I didn't use for over 100 hours of gameplay. But I didn't have to right away. But still, the game was more intense. Even as I was making my way through it, it was more intense than I was used to. You can't pause in Monster Hunter World, which is still a beef that I have with it. And so there's that ramps up the intensity. It also means that not any time is a good time to play it. Because I've got a family, I've got responsibilities, I've got other things that I want and need to make higher priorities in my life than gaming. I need to be able, when my wife comes in and wants to talk to me, to immediately set down the controller and give her my full attention. That was more difficult to do with this game, and so I found I would have to play it after my family had gone to bed, or other times where I felt like it was going to be okay for me to play it with little chance of being interrupted. Eventually, I learned a trick online where you can kind of put your console into rest mode or something, exit out of it, put it in rest mode, and that would kind of work. But that basically is just for single player play, which is primarily how I played the game for over 1,000 hours. How in the world did I learn to love this game? Well, grinding, basically. I realized that, okay, this game doesn't have an experience system, but it kind of does in another way. You are still growing and becoming more powerful, but it's all based on your armor. And I would compare it to the old tabletop dungeon crawl board game Hero Quest. There's no XP in those games. All of the growth of your characters is represented in your loot. And so the money that you gain is kind of an XP currency that allows you to buy things that make you more powerful offensively and defensively. And once I kind of realized that, I was like, okay, so whether I'm grinding for money, which is not much of a thing in these games, or more specifically for monster components, or going out in the world and collecting, I kind of realized, oh, I'm kind of collecting XP, as it were, as I collect components in the world. I'm kind of collecting XP, as it were, when I hunt and kill monsters and carve their body parts, or capture them and get rewards for the quest, or whatever, you know. It's just being presented in a different way, but grinding is still present. And if I'm patient, I can grind my way out of trouble. And that's so important to me in any kind of action game, because I just don't have it in me to really learn how to get good at games. Part of it is because of my temperament. In the heat of battle, I get flustered and I just end up button mashing. You know, I just can't keep my cool enough to really time things with combat animations and stuff. I just can't. But I don't have to in Monster Hunter World. I kept hearing that certain monsters, you know, from experienced players making content online, you know, would say, well, there's definitely going to be a bottleneck that's going to turn off a bunch of players when you get to Anjanath, or when you get to such and such monster. This is where a lot of people are going to drop out. And I kept thinking, okay, well, maybe this will be the monster that I just can't, I get too frustrated and I can't get past. And so I would all the more prepare and grind up my armor and get it exactly where I wanted. I would look up guides online. And this is really where I began to not just accept, but appreciate as part of the experience doing research online. I realized that playing Monster Hunter World, while it's not a role-playing game, I did kind of feel like I was role-playing a hunter. Because there's a lot of... I'm not even a game hunter, not even remotely. But I know for that hobby, there's a lot of prep involved. There's a lot of research and learning involved before you go out and actually do the hunt itself. And so part of the game experience for me was looking on wikis and finding out the weaknesses of monsters, doing my research, figuring out what builds were going to work, learning about builds that other players had created that were going to be useful to my play style. You know, that was all part of the experience I was learning of playing Monster Hunter. And so those monsters that were supposed to scare me off never did. And I really enjoyed the feeling of classic JRPGs where if you grind and you're patient and you prepare, you can take on challenges that you in the moment might not have the cool head to really handle well. You just stat yourself out great. I think it scratches a similar itch to some deck building games like Magic the Gathering, where you can do a lot of planning and thinking in advance. And I also think because I have the temperament of a worrier, and I like to try and plan my way out of troublesome situations. If I think, okay, well, if I can create contingency plans for all these different things that might happen, then I can go in, and even though I'm not a quick thinker in the moment, I will be prepared because I've thought about this in advance. And while that's not always healthy to have that approach to life, it really works for me in Monster Hunter World. And so it was very gratifying to prepare and think ahead and then go in and feel like I've got a real good shot at this, even though there's no way I'm going to keep my cool while Anjanath is breathing fire at me, and roaring really loud. And speaking of, the monster behaviors, the AI behaviors, they really have a lifelike vibe to them. Over time, much like I mentioned with the Elder Scrolls games, you do see the limitations, you do see the puppeteer strings, but it still, even a thousand hours or more into Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter Rise combined, there's a sense in which they feel real. And it reminds me a bit when I'm hunting these monsters of like wrestling with a small dog with a chew toy, and just playing with them. Yes, there's this kind of aggression going on between you, and in the lore of the game, of course, I am killing this monster, I'm slicing it all over the place, but the feeling of the experience is not of me brutalizing some animal, but of me playing aggressively in a fun way with a really engaging animal, really fun animal, I recently spent about 30 minutes doing a deep dive into my love of Monster Hunter and the theological truths that it points me in particular to. If you want me to make that public as kind of an edited down version, let me know. I don't want to beat a dead horse, so I guess I will just stop talking about this for now. But that is something of my journey in how I learned to love my number one game on the list, Monster Hunter World. So what games might I learn to love next? Probably not a Souls-like. I think I've given them a fair shot for sure, but never say never. Dragon's Dogma 2 came close, probably not that. I don't know. What games have you had to learn to love? I would love to hear about your experiences. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.